We're looking today at the extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was a romantic poet, if you have a look over here. A romantic poet. Let's not think about romantic in the way that we think about romantic naturally, a love poet. It's not to do with love and romance in that sense. A romantic poet is a poet who's concerned with man and nature's relationship and feels that the power of nature will always overcome the power of man. He's one of the two really key romantic poets that are included in AQA's collection, the other being Percy Bysshe Shelley, who wrote Ozymandias, and therefore straight away you've got a link between two romantic poets. This one, William Wordsworth, is again that theme of man and nature and the control that man tries to have over nature. But actually, Wordsworth concludes that nature has power over man. Now, at the time of writing, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to get into full swing. And if you think about the Industrial Revolution, what it is man using nature's power to harness for itself. So use of coal and water, for example, to power the turbines, to power the mills, to power the canals, etc. So actually, this is a metaphorical poem for a journey through life, but it's actually Wordsworth in this section worrying about how man tries to control nature, and man will never win because nature always has more power. A few things you need to know about the poem. Firstly, this is an extract from a much longer poem. The Prelude goes on for pages and pages and pages. It's a whole book in itself. And the poem is an epic. It's Wordsworth's comments on life and growing up. And this extract is a part of that where Wordsworth really looks at the change in the pace of life. Okay, so it's written in free verse, which means it's an unstructured poem. There's no particular rhyme scheme to it, although it does have a consistent pace, a consistent rhythm through iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is a series of 5 stressed and 5 unstressed syllables. So, as I always say, if we're going to say something about the structure or about a simile or a language technique or something like that, we must give a reason why. So, why is it in free verse? Well, remember we're talking about a journey through life. So maybe the free verse suggests that life isn't structured, that life can be surprising, that life follows twists and turns and we never know what's going to happen. And so that is reflected in the lack of real structure to the poem, that life takes us in any direction. However, it does have a consistent pace, that iambic pentameter. And maybe here Wordsworth is suggesting that although we don't know which way life is going to take us, it continues to roll on. Each second, each minute, each hour, each day, each week, each month, and so on, just follows naturally. Life continues on at a consistent pace. And perhaps that too is out of our control. The fact that time just rolls on and on and on, and we have no structure to put on that time. And again, it suggests that the power of natural time, the power of nature, overrides man's attempts to control it. Okay, now, let's leave out this bit for now. I want you to do an activity for me. And this is one that I would do in the classroom. And those who've watched my videos and are in my classroom will know that this is the way we start Prelude. And I want to look at these 12 words here. I'm going to read those to you. Sparkling, serious, grave, glittering, trembling, pleasure, like a swan. We've got a phrase there, a simile. Darkness, solitude, summer, desertion, proud. I want you in a minute to sort those words out into 2 sections. We might look at words that are more positive and words that are more negative. Okay, so just pause the video now and sort those words out. So, what we might get is the following. Sparkling, we might see that as more positive. Serious, actually that's kind of more negative, isn't it? And the same with grave. Now, grave in this sense, in any sense, is quite negative, but in this sense doesn't mean a burial grave. It's a word that actually is very similar in meaning to serious, in a dark mood, a grave matter, a serious, important, but generally fearful matter. Glittering, it's quite nice. Trembling links to fear, doesn't it? Pleasure, obvious. Like a swan, perhaps one of the more ambiguous ones, but like a swan suggests grace and elegance and ease. So I'm going to put it on the more positive side. Darkness, I think we'd agree is quite negative. Solitude. If you don't know what solitude means, think about the first three letters, sol. You might think Spanish for sun. But what about adding solo, soul, solitude? Then we're talking about being on your own, being alone. So probably a negative word. Summer, generally quite positive. The sun's shining, quite bright, glorious. Desertion, again, links to solitude, doesn't it? Being alone. And proud. If we're proud of something, that's generally quite a positive feeling. So let's put that positive. So we've got 6 more positive pieces of imagery that make things seem easy, pleasant, nice, joyful. And we've got 6 words which give imagery that are darker, more despairing, more serious, more unhappy. And we'll split those up. The next task then is to take 2 colour highlighters. Take 1 colour for your positive words, 1 colour for your negative words, and find those words in the poem. And when you've highlighted them, a pattern will appear. And that pattern will be this, that we start off very positively. And all of the words that we've ticked for positive imagery come early in the poem. Sparkling, glittering, pleasure, like a swan, summer, proud, all come in the first half of this section of the poem. The other words, more dark, depressing, dreary, grim words, the imagery of darkness and loneliness, they come later on. So let's conclude something about the structure of the poem. This is a poem that changes in mood. This is a poem that talks positively to start with and ends negatively. And we might then start to think about the reasons why. I've talked about how the whole poem is an epic poem about the journey through life. So we might start to conclude that at the start of the poem we're talking about carefree, youth, joy, innocence. And then as we get older through the poem, we start to realise the seriousness of life, that life brings its dreadful moments. And that, in essence, is what the poem is about. Then we're going to look also at this point, because there is a turning point in the poem. I'm going to read it through, but look out for this quote, a huge peak, black and huge, because that is what is the volta, the turning point of the poem, that takes us from being joyful and carefree and happy to being dark and dreary and lonely and in solitude. Here's the poem. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain and, stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep till then the horizons bound a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There, in her mooring place, I left my bark, and went through the meadows, homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Oh, my thoughts, their hunger darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. So let's just go through the story of the poem. It's a very simple story, actually. Wordsworth finds a boat tied to a tree. Now, the boat itself is a metaphor for man's control over nature. If you think about what the boat will have been made from at that point, it will have been made from wood, a natural substance. We've taken that natural element and we've carved it into a shape for our use as man. You might already be thinking about Storm on the Island, how we use natural elements to build the houses there. So there's a link there, certainly. So it's a metaphor for man's control over nature. It's tied to the tree. That in itself gives a hint and slightly foreshadows the trouble later, because although we've carved this boat out of wood and used nature for man's power, it's still nature that holds us back. It's tied to the tree. That's what's stopping us getting out onto the lake. Once he does conquer nature at that point and sails out into the middle of the lake, everything seems to be going gloriously for Wordsworth. We have the sparkling and glittering moonlight guiding his way smoothly through the water. He went heaving like a swan, so he feels that he's graceful and elegant and it's easy, but heaving gives us a little sense of the trouble that he's having. As he gets towards the middle of the lake, he sees in the horizon, the furthest point he can see, this enormous peak, this huge peak, black and huge. Now that mountain in itself shows him that actually in the world he's insignificant, he's small, he's tiny. He will never be big like nature, and nature will always have more power. It's a bit like if you look up at the stars and you realise what your place is in the universe, that you're tiny. It's that sort of moment of revelation that he finds himself feeling small and insignificant. When you're a teenager, when you're young, you do feel like you're the centre of the world. And as you grow older, you do realise that your place in the world is really quite small. You're a small cog in this huge machine. And that's the moment of realisation that Wordsworth has. And that volta, that turning point in the poem, is the point at which he returns back to safety, back to the mooring place, the covert where he found his boat. And that thought haunts him for quite some time after. So let's look at the one key quote we're going to look at in this section. The next two sections about this poem, I'll take the first half of the poem, then I'll take the second half of the poem. But a huge peak, black and huge, very memorable quote, easy one to remember. And I've already talked about that this is the volta, the turning point. This is the realisation from Wordsworth that his place in the world is tiny compared to nature. So the whole thing is a metaphor for the power of nature, that peak, that mountain. A peak is another word for a mountain. That huge peak is a metaphor for nature's power. And in comparison, he's insignificant. He's tiny. Man is tiny compared to the overall power of nature in the world. But also, let's look at other things. It's one of those great quotes that you can really squeeze a lot out of. Let's take the imagery of black. Black is a dark colour. It suggests fear. It suggests darkness. It suggests the depression that comes later in the poem. So that imagery there of black is something that you could talk about, that change of mood. Whereas darkness up until that point had been the sparkling and glittering moonlight through the dark. Now we've got that fearful imagery. And also you've got the repetition of huge, a huge peak, black and huge. Why does Wordsworth repeat that word huge? Well, he's trying to emphasize and establish the enormity of nature, the huge power that nature has. And it suggests a feeling of awe of nature, of wonder at nature, but also of fear itself, of the massiveness of the nature that's around him and his insignificant tiny part in the world.